Hey everybody, and welcome to a brand new study. Can you open your Bibles with me to the second book of the Bible? After Genesis, we find the book of Exodus, and we're launching over the course of the next few months into a study of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Here's going to be our key phrase throughout all of those books. It's words of God to the children of Israel, you shall be my people. Today we want to talk about Exodus 1 through 4, when God called a man named Moses. Here's how Exodus 1 begins. Verse 1, these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household. We're reading about a family who traveled from Canaan up here down to the land of Egypt. And we might remind ourselves as a class here in a few minutes, why? Why did that family travel from Canaan down to Egypt? Our narrator in Ephesians chapter 1, verse 5 tells us there were 70. Exodus chapter 1, verse 5, all the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. The family comes down as 70, but they didn't stay 70 very long. They grew. They really grew. In fact, in Exodus 1 verse 7, the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. But there was also a king in Egypt. We know the kings in Egypt as pharaohs, right? Exodus 1 verse 8 tells us there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph, and he convinced the people of Egypt to deal shrewdly with the Israelites. In fact, this is our summary, Exodus 1, 13 and 14. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the fields. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. But the children of Israel just kept growing. And so the Pharaoh came up with another plan. I want you, anytime there is a son, you can see it in your Bibles, Exodus 1:22, the Pharaoh commanded all his people, every son that is born to the Hebrews, you shall cast into the Nile River. Can you imagine how terrifying that would have been? In Exodus chapter 2 and verse 1, we read about a man from the house of Levi who went and took as his wife a Levite woman. A little later in Exodus, we're told the names of this man and woman. The name of the man was Amram, and the name of the woman was Jochebed. They came from the tribe of Levi. They were married and they had a son. And they knew what Pharaoh had said. And so they hid that son for the next 3 months, and eventually they couldn't hide him anymore. And so his mother put him in a tiny ark, a little boat that she allowed to start floating on the Nile River. You've probably heard the story before, how this baby was found by the daughter of Pharaoh. In fact, she adopted that baby and she gave him a name. We can read it in Exodus 2, verse 10. When the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter and he became her son. She named him Moses, drawn out of the water, because she said, I drew him out of the water. Moses grew up in Egypt. Moses grew up in the most powerful family of Egypt. When he was 40 years old, we don't read that in Exodus. In fact, it comes from the New Testament. Many centuries later, a disciple of Jesus named Stephen was preaching a sermon, and he talked a little bit about Moses' life, and he lets us know in Acts 7, verse 23, that Moses was 40 years old. When Moses is 40 years old, he has to run for his life. He sees an Egyptian who is beating one of the children of Israel, one of the Hebrews, and Moses strikes that Egyptian down. But it becomes known to Pharaoh, and so Moses, who has always grown up here in Egypt, flees to this area known as Sinai. And that's where he's going to live for the next 40 years. In Exodus chapter 2 and verse 21, we read about him meeting a woman and marrying a woman named Zipporah. Moses may have grown up as a prince in Egypt, but he spends the next 40 years as a shepherd. Exodus 3 verse 1 tells us that he was keeping the flock of his father-in-law. Moses' father-in-law, his name was Jethro, and Jethro was a priest in Midian. Moses is over here in Sinai for the next 40 years. Meanwhile, the rest of the children of Israel are still there in Egypt. And I want you to listen. Maybe this is our key passage for this evening's study. Exodus 2, 23 through 25. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery, and they cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God. And God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. God is going to do something about it. And so he appears to Moses. Moses ran when he was 40. He has spent 40 years in Sinai. A little bit of math tells us he's 80 years old. Exodus 3 verse 1, keeping the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian, and Moses led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb. We know it also as Mount Sinai, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appears to Moses in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush that's on fire, but it's not burnt up. And the Lord tells Moses about the affliction of the people in Egypt, about his plan to bring them out to the promised land. And he says, Moses, you're the man I've chosen to lead them. We'll talk a little bit as a class about how Moses has 5 reasons why this is a bad idea. He says to God in Exodus 3 verse 11, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? In verse 13, he says, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What should I say to them? In chapter 4, verse 1, they won't believe me. They won't listen to my voice. They'll say, the Lord didn't appear to you. In verse 10, oh my Lord, I'm not eloquent, and I've never been. I'm not good with my mouth. Finally, he says in verse 13, oh my Lord, please send someone else. But by the end of Exodus 4, Moses and his brother Aaron are on their way back to Egypt when they begin sharing with the elders of Israel that the Lord had seen their affliction. They bowed their heads and they worshiped. God was preparing to lead his people out of Egypt. We've got a lot to talk about. Thanks for being in class today. Hope I've helped you get prepped for some good discussion. Have a good rest of your class. I'll see you real soon.